Under a starless mountain sky, hoofbeats rose from the dark road below, steady, deliberate, coming closer. Torches bobbed through the pines like restless eyes. A voice drifted up through the cold night air, too calm for men carrying guns. It laid claim to land that had already been paid for in blood 12 years earlier. At the upstairs window of the cabin, a woman sat motionless, an old rifle resting across her knees. The worn wooden stock bore deep carved words, smoothed by years of a thumb, tracing the same sentence over and over. This land was bought in blood. It will not be sold in silence. A single gunshot cracked the quiet open. Dry grass along the fence caught fire, flames racing in the mountain wind. Shouts broke out. Hooves thundered into the yard. Her fingers settled on the trigger. Below, two figures faced each other in the mud, 12 years of silence pressing between them like a loaded gun. Then a bell rang out sharp, clear, and wrong for the hour into the rising chaos. Copper Creek, 1880. The chalk dust hung in the air like snow that refused to fall. Wren Hartley stood at the board, sleeves pushed up, letters perfect. Because they had to be perfect. Because a woman like her didn't get to be sloppy. Not with her handwriting. Not with anything. 6 times 7, she said, silence. A boy scratched his slate. Somewhere behind her, through the thin schoolhouse wall, she heard her to hit. Always the whisper. That's her, the fat one. Teaches the Colton boys children. Can't teach herself a husband, though. She didn't turn around. She never turned around. 42, she counted in her head. 6 times 7 is 42. Say it. Smile. Don't let your face crack. 42, the boy said. Good. Her voice came out steady. It always came out steady. That was the trick of it. Steady on the outside. Something else entirely underneath. She dismissed the class at 3. Watched them scatter across the dirt like a lamb with a thrown seed, laughing free. She envied that. The freedom of not yet knowing what the world would say about your body before it ever bothered to ask about your mind. 3 years since Thomas Ridley stood her up in front of half the county. 3 years since he'd looked at her, really looked. Up and down. Like she was livestock he was reconsidering, and said the words that still lived in her chest like a splinter too deep to dig out. I can't marry a woman folks will laugh at, Wren. It ain't about you. It's about what people say. It was about her. It was always about her. She locked the schoolhouse door. Walked home along the creek path, boots sinking in soft mud, sun low and orange over the ridgeline. And she told herself, the way she told herself every single evening, you are more than what they see. Except some the words felt thinner than others. Tonight was one of those nights. Which was, of course, the exact night everything changed. She heard him before she saw him. Boots. Heavy ones. Not townsfolk boots, those had a certain rhythm, a certain politeness to them. These were different. Slower. Deliberate. Like the man attached to them had never once in his life worried about being noticed. Wren turned the corner by the mercantile, and there he was, filling the doorway of Halloran's store like he'd been carved to fit it, and then they'd built the doorway too small on purpose. 6.5 feet, maybe more, shoulders like a barn door, a beard that hadn't seen a razor in longer than was polite, dark hair curling under a battered hat, and eyes her, his eyes, brown, deep, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She knew him. Everyone in Copper Creek knew of Jonah Kane, even if hardly anyone had spoken 2 words to him. The man from the mountain came down maybe twice a year for supplies and gunpowder, and left before anyone could properly corner him with questions. Folks said his family used to own half the valley before something happened. Folks said a lot of things. Folks were not generally to be trusted. He was looking straight at her, which made no sense, because men like Jonah Kane did not look at women like Wren Hartley. Not on purpose. Not for longer than it took to glance past them toward something more interesting. Except he wasn't looking past her. He was walking toward her. Her stomach dropped somewhere near her boots. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. What did I do? Did I say something? Did someone tell him something about me? Is this about the schoolhouse? Rent? This Miss Hartley? Lord, his voice. Low and rough like gravel dragged across a riverbed. That's me, she said. Which was a stupid thing to say. Obviously it was her. Who else would it be? Jonah Kane, I know who you are. A pause. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing on the next sentence before letting it out. Need a wife, he said. The street didn't stop. The street kept moving. A wagon creaked past. A dog barked somewhere. Mrs. Findlay's laundry flapped on its line, but for Wren, everything narrowed down to those 4 words hanging in the air between them like smoke that wouldn't clear. I'm sorry. You heard me. I did. She stopped. Start it again. I need you to say it slower. Because I think my ears have decided to lie to me. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. I need a wife, he repeated. Slower this time, like he was humoring her. You need somewhere folks won't look at you sideways every hour of every day. That landed harder than the first sentence had. Because he wasn't wrong. Because somehow this mountain of a stranger had summed up her entire life in one sentence. And it stung worse coming from someone who didn't know her at all than it ever had from someone who did. "You don't know anything about me," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she meant it to. "I know enough. You know gossip. I know you teach every child in this town, regardless of what their daddy owes at the mercantile. I know you stayed when the last 2 teachers before you didn't last a winter. I know you don't run from hard things." He tilted his head slightly. "That's not gossip, Miss Hartley. That's just watching. He'd been watching her. Her cheeks went hot, which was absurd, which was the least appropriate reaction I have to a man who'd just proposed marriage on a public street like he was discussing the price of flour. "Mr. Kane, I don't even know you. You'll have time to. If you say yes, and if I say no, then I tip my hat and I ride back up the mountain. And you never see me again," he said it simply. No threat in it, no pleading either. Just fact, laid flat on the table between them like a hand of cards he wasn't afraid to show. She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. Every proper instinct in her told her to say no, to walk away, to go home and lock her door and laugh about this later with nobody, because she had nobody to laugh with. Which was, in fact, exactly the problem, wasn't it? "Why me?" she asked instead. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like relief that she'd asked the real question instead of the polite one. "Because you don't need a man to tell you who you are," he said. "I've watched enough women in this town shrink themselves down, trying to fit what some fella wants. You don't do that." He paused. "I need someone who can hold her ground when winter comes." Not other things, too, other things. What did that mean? What was he not saying? Because there was clearly something he wasn't saying, something sitting behind his teeth that he decided not to let out yet, and every instinct she had the same instinct that once told her. Thomas Ridley's smile didn't quite reach. His eyes was screaming at her to ask, but she didn't ask because the street was full of eyes. Because Mrs. Patterson had already stopped her cart to stare. Because this was not a conversation for the middle of Main Street. "I need time," she said. "You've got till Sunday. That's 4 days. Winter don't wait on manners, Miss Hartley." And with that, he touched the brim of his hat, an oddly gentle gesture from a man built like a felled tree, and walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't need to. He knew somehow that she'd be watching him go. She was. By the time she reached her cottage, the whole town knew. Of course they did. This was Copper Creek. News here traveled faster than weather. Mrs. Odette Finch was waiting on Report step like a crow on a fence post, hands folded, eyebrows already halfway up her forehead. "Well," Mrs. Finch said. Well, don't. I haven't said a word." "You're about to, Jonah Kane," Mrs. Finch said anyway, because of course she did, because Mrs. Finch had never in her life let a silence sit unfilled. "The mountain man asked you to marry him, in front of the mercantile, in front of God and Mrs. Patterson, which is nearly the same thing, Odette. Is it true?" Wren sat down hard on the porch step beside her. The wood was cold through her skirt. Somewhere down the road a dog was barking at nothing, the way dogs do when the whole world feels a little bit wrong and they're the only ones honest enough to say so. "It's true," Wren said, and I don't know, Wren, I don't know, Odette. Her hands twisted in her lap. "He's a stranger. He's enormous, and he lives on a mountain, and he barely said 6 sentences to me, and half of them were about winter. But there was always a but." Odette knew it. Wren knew it. The whole porch seemed to know it, sitting there in the fading light, waiting for her to say the thing she was clearly circling like a hawk that hadn't decided if the ground below was safe to land on. "But he looked at me," Wren said quietly, "like I was a person. Not a hot a shape he was disappointed by." Odette's face softened, just slightly. "Thomas Ridley did that to you," she said. "Not a question. Thomas Ridley did a lot of things to me. You've never once told me what he said." That day, Wren looked out at the road, at the long orange light dying over the hills. 3 years, and she still couldn't say it out loud without her throat closing up like a fist. "He said folks would laugh," she said finally, "at him. For choosing me." Silence. "Well," Ozette's voice gone rough, "Thomas Ridley can go choke on a chicken bone," which startled a laugh out of Wren, a real one. The kind that hurt a little on its way out, because it had been sitting unused for so long. "That's not very Christian of you, Odette. I'll pray about it later." They sat there a while longer, the two of them, until the sky went the color of a bruise, and the crickets started up their evening argument in the grass. "What are you going to do?" Odette asked. "I don't know," Wren said again. Except this time it felt less like a confession, and more like the beginning of an answer. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the same crack in the plaster she'd traced 100 nights before, and she thought about Jonah Kane's face. Not his size, though, that was hard to forget, hard to unsee. A man built like the mountains he came from. Not even his voice, though, that had settled somewhere low in her chest and stayed there like a held breath. It was his eyes. Tired. Not the tired of a man who hadn't slept. The tired of a man who'd been carrying something for a very long time and had simply forgotten what it felt like to set it down. She knew that tired. She recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in a stranger's window. Which frightened her more than anything else he'd said, because it's one thing to be proposed to by a stranger. It's another thing entirely to look at that stranger and think, I know exactly what that wait feels like. Sunday came faster than 4 days should have. She spent Saturday morning grading arithmetic she barely saw, the numbers swimming in front of her, while her mind kept circling back to the same porch step, the same conversation, the same 4 words. I need a wife. It was Wade Colton who interrupted her. She didn't hear him come in the schoolhouse door, didn't creak the way it usually did, which should have told her something, should have been its own small warning, except she was too deep in her own head to notice. Miss Hartley, she startled, chalk skittering across the slate she was marking Mr. Colton. I didn't hear you. Wade Colton was a handsome man, everyone said so. Tall, though nowhere near Jonah Kane's height, with the kind of polished good looks that came from money, and knew it. He owned more land in the valley than anyone else, ran cattle on it, held paper on half the ranches in the county one way or another. He also, 3 years ago, had courted her for exactly 6 weeks before quietly disappearing when Thomas Ridley made his little speech at the social. Wade had never said a cruel word to her. He'd simply never spoken to her again, which was, in its own way, its own kind of cruelty. I heard the news, he said, settling himself against her desk without being asked. About Kane, news travels. It does in a town this size, he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. It never had. I have to say, I was surprised, were you? A man like that, coming down off his mountain for a wife. Never done it before. Not once in, 10 years he's been up there? He shook his head slowly, like a man puzzling over a math problem he already knew the answer to. Strange thing, timing. Something cold moved through her chest. What do you mean by that? Nothing. He shrugged, too casual. The shrug of a man who very much meant something. Just an observation. Funny how a man decides he needs a wife the same season the schoolhouse land comes up for a lease renewal, is all. Her stomach turned over, because that landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to land. The schoolhouse sat on land Wade Colton held paper on, land the town leased from him year to year. Land she'd spent 8 years fighting to keep, because without it there was no school, and without school there was no her. Not really. Not the version of herself she'd fought so hard to build, after Ohio, after Thomas, after everything. Are you suggesting Mr. Kane proposed to me because of the schoolhouse land? I'm not suggesting anything. He held up both hands, all innocence, all smooth denial. I'm simply saying it's an interesting coincidence. A man appears out of nowhere, proposes to the one woman in town sitting stealing us with the town land I've been meaning to discuss with the town council. He pushed off the desk, straightened his coat. You're a smart woman, Miss Hartley. I'm sure you'll figure out what to make of it. And then he left, just like that. Left the seed planted and walked out the door like a man who'd simply come by to mention the weather. Rin sat very still for a long moment. Which no. Wait, that didn't make sense. Because if Wade wanted the schoolhouse land, why would he want her married, settled, protected by a husband with a mountain full of resources behind him? Wouldn't that make her harder to push out? Not easier. Unless he wanted her gone from town entirely. Unless a wedding meant she'd move. Up the mountain. Away from the schoolhouse. Away from the land he could then simply take, uncontested. No teacher standing between him and the lease. Her hands had gone cold. Except she had no proof of any of it. Nothing but a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a comment dropped like a stone into still water, just to watch the ripples. She hated that it worked. She hated that already. Less than an hour later, she was sitting at her desk, turning Jonah Kane's proposal over in her mind like a coin she was checking for a counterfeit stamp. Was any of it real? Was any of it about me at all? She found Joan at the edge of town, near the livery, checking the cinch on a horse the color of wet clay. He looked up when her shadow fell across him. Didn't smile. Men like him, she was learning, rarely did Miss Hartley. I need to ask you something. All right, did Wade Colton put you up to this? The question came out sharper than she'd planned. She watched it land, watched something flicker across his face. Quick, gone before she could name it. Confusion, maybe. Or something closer to insult, Colton, he said, like the name tasted bad in his mouth. What's Colton got to do with anything? He came to see me today. Said it was funny timing. You proposing right when the schoolhouse lease is up for renewal. She crossed her arms. Said it like he expected me to draw a conclusion. Jonah's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped there. Once hard, I've spoken to Wade Colton exactly twice in my life, he said. Once to tell him no when he offered to buy my north pasture. Once to tell him no again when he offered more the second time. He set the saddle strap down slow, deliberate, like a man forcing his hands to stay calm when the rest of him wanted to do something else entirely. I didn't come down off that mountain because of him. I came down because I'm alone up there, Miss Hartley. And I'm tired of living alone, and I watched you for 2 years at church, at the Mercantile, and I decided you were the only woman in this county who might understand what that feels like. That's a very convenient answer. It's the true one. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. You can believe it or not. That's your business. But I didn't ride down here on Wade Colton's say-so. I'd sooner marry a rattlesnake. She wanted to believe him, which frightened her almost as much as the question itself. Because wanting to believe a man and having reason to was not, she'd learned the hard way, the same thing. Why does he want the schoolhouse land? She asked slowly. Do you know? I don't know what Colton wants, Jonah said. I know what he does. He wants everything. Always has. My family found that out the hard way. He stopped himself there. Physically stopped, jaw clamping shut, eyes sliding away toward the mountains, like the words had gotten too close to something he wasn't ready to say, Mr. Kane. That's a conversation for another day, he said, and something in his voice that closed the subject as firmly as a door. Right now I need an answer, Miss Hartley. Sunday's tomorrow. She looked at him a long moment, at the size of him, the stillness of him, the tiredness behind his eyes that she still hadn't stopped thinking about since the moment she first saw it. I need to think, she said. Then think. He didn't push, didn't argue, just nodded once, swung up onto the clay-colored horse, and rode off toward the mountain without another word, leaving her standing there in the dust with a question she didn't have an answer to, and a feel in her chest she couldn't quite name, trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. Which, for a woman who'd had hers broken clean in half 3 years ago, was a much more dangerous thing to feel. That night she sat at her small table with the marriage contract. In front of her, the one Jonah had left folded on the schoolhouse desk 2 days before, back when this had all still felt like something that might not really happen. Marriage of practical arrangement between Jonah Kane and Wren Hartley. Entered for mutual benefit, wife to retain right to continue teaching. Husband to provide protection and provision, practical. He'd used that word to her face too, practical. Except nothing about the way her chest tightened when she thought of him felt practical. Nothing about the memory of his eyes, tired, honest, watching her like she was worth watching, felt like arithmetic. There was a knock. Odette again, she assumed, come to gossip her out of her decision or into it. She never could tell which way that woman would land. But it wasn't Odette. It was Dr. Amos Reyes. The town's only physician, an old family friend who'd known her since she first arrived in Copper Creek 8 years back, half frozen with grief and pride in equal measure. Wren, he took off his hat. May I come in? Of course. He sat heavy in her one good chair, the way men do when they've spent all day on their feet and haven't yet remembered how to stop. I heard about Kane's proposal, he said. Everyone's heard. I'm not here to gossip. He rubbed a hand over his tired face. I'm here because I knew his father, that stopped her cold. His father, Ezra Kane, owned near everything up that mountain and half the valley besides. Good man. Fair man. Alma's eyes went somewhere distant, somewhere back in time. Died 12 years ago. Jonah was 17. How did he die? Fell, Amos said. Too quick, too flat. That's what the coroner said anyway. You don't sound like you believe that. He was quiet a long moment, turning his hat over in his hands like he was deciding how much of the truth he owed her. Ezra Kane had been fighting Wade Colton's father over grazing rights on that north pasture for the better part of a year before he died, Amos said finally. Then one day he's found at the bottom of a ravine he'd walked 1,000 times without incident. No witnesses. No explanation. And within a month, Colton's father was making offers on Kane land, like the whole family's grief was just a business opportunity waiting to be exploited. He shook his head slowly. I never had proof of anything, Wren. I want to be clear about that. I'm an old man telling you an old story. But I think Jonah Kane grew up watching a Colton circle, his family's land like a buzzard circles. Something dying, Amos said. And I think that boy has spent 12 years up on that mountain, half out of grief and half standing guard over the only thing his father left him. He looked at her then, and his eyes were kind and tired and old. I'm not telling you to marry him. I'm not telling you not to. I'm telling you that if you do, you're marrying more than a man. You're marrying a promise he's been keeping since he was 17 years old. And Wade Colton is still circling. Wren sat very still, because that changed everything. Because that explained the tiredness in Jonah's eyes, the way his jaw had locked shut when she asked about Colton. The way he'd said my family found that out the hard way, and then stopped himself. Like the sentence was a wound he wasn't ready to touch. And because it meant Wade Colton's little visit to her schoolhouse hadn't been idle gossip at all, it had been a warning shot. From a man who'd apparently been circling this family for 12 years, and had no intention of stopping now. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. Wren stood at her window a long time before she finally reached for her shawl. She found Jonah waiting exactly where he said he'd be by the church steps, hat in hand, that same clay-colored horse tied nearby, patient as its owner. He didn't rush toward her when she approached. Didn't smile, didn't perform relief, or hope the way another man might have, angling for sympathy. He just waited, watching her walk the last stretch of road like every step was its own answer he was reading in advance. Miss Hartley, Mr. Kane, a silence. The kind that said more than words ever could. I spoke with Dr. Reyes. She said. Something shifted in his face. Guarded, suddenly. Braced, did you? He told me about your father. For a moment, Jonah said nothing at all. His hand tightened on the brim of his hat, knuckles going pale, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, like the words had to climb up out of somewhere deep before they'd agree to come out. My father didn't fall, he said quietly. I've believed that since I was 17 years old, and I've never had a shred of proof to back it up. Just a feeling in my gut that's never once let up in 12 years. He looked at her directly. I should have told you that myself. Before you heard it from someone else. Because it's not a pretty thing to bring to a woman you're asking to marry you, he said. Because I didn't want you saying yes out of pity or saying no out of fear. I wanted you to say yes because you wanted the life I was offering. Not because you got tangled up in a grudge that's been mine alone for 12 years. Which was, she realized, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember. Is that what this is? She asked slowly. A grudge? It's a promise, he said. My forefather built something on that mountain. Something Colton's family has wanted since before I was born. I made a vow at his grave that I wouldn't let it go. Not 1 acre. Not while I'm breathing, as it didn't waver. That's the truth of what you'd be marrying into, Miss Hartley. Not just a husband. A fight that started before either of us was old enough to understand it. The wind picked up. Somewhere behind them, church bells started their slow Sunday call, and Wren stood there with her shawl pulled tight and her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest. She thought, briefly, of every promise she'd ever been handed and watched crumble the moment it required courage. Then she looked at this man, enormous, tired, honest to the point of bluntness, standing in front of her offering not comfort, not ease, but the truth, all of it. Even the parts that made him look less than perfect. I want to see the contract again, she said. Relief moved through his shoulders. Quick and unguarded, there and gone, I've got it here. And I want one more thing added to it. Name it if Wade Colton ever comes for that land, she said. I fight beside you. Not behind you, beside you. Something in Jonah Kane's face changed then. Not quite a smile she was starting to understand. He didn't do those easily, but something close. Something warm, buried deep, cracking open just slightly at the edges. Deal, he said. And that was how Wren Hartley signed her name to a marriage of convenience with a stranger from the mountain. 3 days after, he asked, in front of a church she'd attended alone for 8 years, with a promise of danger written into the very bones of it. She told herself it was practical. She told herself a great many things that week, most of them lies of one small size or another. The wedding itself was quiet. Smaller than quiet, really just Reverend Boyd, Odette dabbing her eyes despite insisting she wouldn't, and Dr. Reyes standing witness with his hat, pressed over his heart like he was watching something hoping he'd been on longer than he'd admit. Gonor's shirt that still had the fold creases from a trunk that hadn't been opened in years. Wren wore her good blue dress, the only one that fit her properly, the only one she'd never once let herself hate. When Reverend Boyd asked if she took this man, she said yes before he'd even finished the question, which surprised her more than anyone. Jonah lifted her hand when the vows were done and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, slow, careful, like she was something that might startle. His hand around hers was rough and enormous and warm, and for one strange unguarded moment, standing there in front of God and 4 witnesses, Wren Hartley forgot to be afraid. The ride out of town took most of the afternoon. The road climbed steadily upward, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile, until the town below shrank to a scatter of rooftops, and then disappeared entirely behind a shoulder of pine-covered ridge. Wren sat beside him on the wagon seat, her small trunk rattling in the back, and watched the world she'd built for 8 years vanish behind them. Second thoughts, Jonah asked, not looking at her, eyes on the road. A few, she admitted. You? None. A pause. Well, one, what's that? Whether you'll like the house, that of all things made her laugh a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she caught him glancing sideways at the sound of it like it was something he wanted to hear again. The cabin, when they finally reached it, sat tucked into a clearing with the mountains rising behind it like watchful shoulders, bigger than she'd expected. Sturdier, a porch that had clearly been swept that morning, fresh curtains hanging crooked in the front window like a man had hung them himself, in a hurry, hoping they'd look right by the time she arrived. They did. They looked exactly right. I made up a room, Jonah said, lifting her trunk like it weighed nothing at all, east-facing. Morning. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and cedar. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and beside it she stopped short, staring a bookshelf, half full, wool spines, titles she recognized, and beside them, gaps, empty spaces like a man had been slowly building a shelf for a collection he didn't yet have. You read, she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Something flickered across his face. Old shame, maybe. Or old caution my mother taught before she married my father, he said quietly. Insisted I keep it up, even after he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Wren crossed to the shelf, ran her fingers along the spines. Tennyson. Dickens. A worn leather journal tucked at the end, the initials EK pressed faintly into the cover. Your father's? My mother's, actually. His voice had gone rough. She died when I was young. That's near all I have left of her handwriting. Wren looked at him, then really looked. The way he'd looked at her that first day on Main Street and saw, for the first time, not a mountain of a stranger, but a boy who'd lost both his parents before he'd finished growing into the size God gave him, standing alone on a mountain for 12 years, with nothing but a grudge and a bookshelf and a promise to keep. I brought some books of my own, she said softly. I hope there's room. There's room, he said. I've been saving it. That night, after supper, beef stew he'd clearly practiced making more than once, bread slightly too dense, but offered with such careful I'd have eaten it if it were made of stone wren. Unpacked her trunk in the east-facing room, laying out what little she owned across the narrow dresser. Her hand brushed something hard and unfamiliar at the bottom of the trunk, wedged beneath her spare petticoats. She frowned, drew it out. A wooden case, not hers. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. Inside lay a rifle, old but well kept, the metal dulled with age and careful handling. And along the stock, carved deep into the wood by a hand that had clearly taken its time, a line of words worn smooth from years of a thumb tracing over them. Again and again, the way a man traces a wound to remind himself it's still there. This land was bought in blood. It will not be sold in silence. Wren stood very still, the case heavy in her hands, the fire crackling low in the next room, and understood finally, completely exactly what kind of vow she'd married into. Not a practical arrangement. Not a business contract between two lonely people making the best of hard circumstances. A war that had started 12 years ago and never once stopped simmering beneath the surface of this quiet mountain house. She thought of Wade Colton's smile in her schoolhouse doorway, of Dr. Reyes's careful, worried eyes, of Jonah's jaw locking shut every time Colton's name came up, like the name itself was a wound that hadn't healed straight. And she thought with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin walls, that whatever was coming for them, it hadn't finished coming yet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something breathing. Wren closed the case slowly, set it back exactly as she'd found it, and stood a long moment at the window, looking out over land that had cost a man his father and might yet cost his son everything else. Then she went downstairs, sat across the fire from her new husband, and said the only thing she could think to say. Tell me about him, she said. Your father. Tell me everything. And Jonah Kane, who had spent 12 years alone on a mountain guarding a grief no one had asked him to carry, looked up at her with something raw and grateful breaking open behind his tired eyes, and began, finally, to talk. He talked until the fire burned low and the candle guttered, about a man who used to whistle while he mended fences, who read Tennyson aloud on Sunday evenings, who had never once raised his voice in anger, except the one time a Colton hand had struck a horse too hard in front of him. Wren listened the way she listened to her best students fully, without interrupting, letting the whole of the thing arrive in its own time. By the time he finished, something had shifted between them. Not love, not yet. But the beginning of the kind of trust that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply quietly moves in and starts unpacking its own trunk. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that took its time deciding whether it wanted to be day at all. Wren woke to the unfamiliar sound of an axe already at work somewhere outside, steady and rhythmic, and lay still a moment beneath quilts that smelled of cedar in someone else's life before remembering, with a small jolt, that it was her life too now. She found Jonah in the yard, sleeves rolled despite the cold, splitting kindling with the kind of economy of motion that came from years of doing a thing alone and never once having to explain the doing of it to anyone else. You didn't have to let me sleep, she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. Figured you earned it. He set the axe head down in the stump, wiped his palms on his trousers. Talking half the night takes it out of a man. Reckon it does the same to a woman who has to sit there and listen to 12 years of it. I didn't mind listening, I noticed. Something almost shy crossed his face again, that same expression she was beginning to recognize as rare and valuable, a crack in the granite. Nobody's ever asked me to say all that out loud before. Dr. Reyes knows pieces. Otis Bell knows pieces. You're the first person who's got the whole of it, she thought about that as she helped him carry the split wood to the stack beside the porch, her arms full, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. There was something almost holy in being trusted with the whole of a thing rather than the careful edited pieces most people offered up for safekeeping. My turn, she said, once the wood was stacked. Fair's fair, he looked at her, surprised. Your turn for what? You gave me your father. I ought to give you something back. She settled onto the porch step, patted the space beside her, and waited until he sat, his size making the whole structure creak good-naturedly beneath them. Thomas Ridley wasn't the worst of it. Not really. The worst of it was after. 6 months of eating supper alone every single night and telling myself I preferred it that way. I got very good at lying to myself, Jonah. Better than I ever was at arithmetic. You don't seem like a woman who lies easy. I don't lie to other people easy, she corrected. Myself was a different matter entirely. I told myself for 3 years that I'd chosen this. The solitude, the schoolroom instead of a family. Told myself it was a fine trade, and mostly I even believed it, right up until a stranger stood in a doorway and asked me to stop pretending. Jonah was quiet a long moment, watching the mist burn slowly off the tree line. I'm glad I asked then, he said finally. So am I. She leaned just slightly, until her shoulder rested against the solid warmth of his arm, and neither of them moved to correct the distance. So am I. The first snow came early that year. Not the real snow, not the kind that buried roads, and stopped time just a dusting, a warning, white sugar scattered across the pines like the mountain clearing its throat before winter proper arrived. Wren stood on the porch that morning, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the cold, and watched her breath curl up into nothing. 3 weeks married, 3 weeks, and already the rhythm of this new life had settled into her bones, like it had always belonged there. Which frightened her a little, because settled that easily had a way of being taken away just as easily. Don't think like that, she told herself. Old habit. Ohio habit. The habit of a woman who'd learned young that happiness was a thing you weren't allowed to trust. You're up early, Jonah's voice behind her, rough with sleep, and she turned to find him filling the doorway the way he filled every doorway. Hair still mussed, eyes soft in a way they never quite were in daylight. Couldn't sleep. Cold? No. A pause. Yes, a little. He didn't say anything. Just crossed the porch and settled a blanket around her shoulders. One he must have grabbed off the bed without her noticing, and the weight of it, the warmth of it, still holding his heat, made something in her chest go tight and strange. Better, he asked. Better. He stood beside her a while, both of them watching the snow settle over land his father had died defending. And she thought about how 3 weeks ago she hadn't known this man's middle name. And now she knew the sound his breathing made when he slept, the exact careful way he touched things he loved, like he was afraid they might not stay. Books, photographs, her. I'm going to open the schoolroom today, she said. For the mountain children. The ones too far from town to walk to Copper Creek. Jonah nodded slowly. There's 4 families up this way with young ones. Maybe 5. You built me a room for it. I should use it. I built you that room, he said. Because I've wanted you to have something that was yours up here. Not because I expected anything from it. He looked at her then, and there was something almost shy in it, which seemed impossible on a man his size. But I'm glad you want to, she was beginning to understand exactly the kind of thing Jonah Kane said. Quiet, unshowy. True all the way through. The schoolroom filled faster than she expected. 4 children the first week, 7 by the second. Mountain families who'd never had a teacher within reach, who arrived on muleback and on foot, cheeks red with cold, eyes wide at the sight of a proper chalkboard and a proper desk, and a woman who spoke to them like their minds mattered. She loved it. She loved it in a way that surprised her, the particular ache of watching a child's face light up over a word they'd finally sounded out correctly. The particular pride of a mother lingering in the doorway just to listen. You're good at this, Jonah said one evening, watching her grade slates by lamplight. her feet tucked up under her on the settee they'd silently agreed to share instead of separate chairs. I've had practice, not just practice. He set down the harness he'd been mending. You make them feel like they matter. That's not something you learn. That's something you are. She looked up at him. The firelight caught the silver just beginning at his temples, made him look older and younger, all at once. And she thought not for the first time that this man saw her clearer than anyone ever had. Which was its own kind of terrifying, because seeing someone clearly means seeing all of them. And she still hadn't told him about the whisper that lived in the back of her mind, the one that woke up every time she caught her reflection in the window glass. One that still, asked her, what does he really see when he looks at you? Read me something, he said, nodding toward the book of Tennyson on the side table. So she did. And his eyes stayed on her the whole time, not the page, and something in her chest cracked open just a little wider. A letter came from Copper Creek that same week, carried up the mountain by one of Otis Bell's boys on his way home from the mill. Odette's handwriting, cramped and urgent, the way it always got when she had more to say than the page could hold. You'll want to know Mrs. Patterson stood up in church on Sunday and told the whole congregation that Ren Kane's schoolroom on the mountain has more pupils than the one in town ever did, and that maybe folks ought to think harder before they run a good teacher off with their tongues. I about fell out of my pew. Never thought I'd see the day. Ren read it twice, sitting at the writing desk Jonah had built her, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since she was 24 years old. Good news? Jonah asked, glancing up from the harness he was mending. Strange news, she said. Good, I think. I haven't decided yet. She rode down to Copper Creek 3 days later, her first trip back, since the wedding, with a satchel of arithmetic slates that needed replacing, and a reason, if she was honest with herself, to see whether the letter had told the truth. It had. Mrs. Patterson stopped her outside the mercantile. Not to whisper this time, but to speak plainly, awkwardly, the way people do when they're trying out an apology they've never practiced. Mrs. Kane, I hope you're keeping well up there. I am, thank you. The children talk about your schoolroom, the mountain ones. My sister's boy walks 2 miles to hear you teach fractions, if you can believe it. Mrs. Patterson's eyes didn't slide away the way they used to. They stayed. I don't suppose I ever told you were a fine teacher here, too. I should have said so more often. Wren stood very still on the boardwalk, the satchel of slates heavy in her arms, and did not know for a moment what to do with kindness that arrived so plainly, with no catch hidden inside it. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, she managed finally. That means more than you know. She thought about that exchange the whole ride home, not with triumph, exactly, but with something quieter and stranger. It wasn't that the town had changed its mind about her shape. It hadn't, not really. Some whispers she suspected still followed her when her back was turned, but she had stopped needing them to change their minds. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. She told Jonah about it that evening, and he listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet a long moment before he spoke. You know what I think, he said. What? I think you were never the one who needed fixing. He reached over, took her hand, turned it palm up like he was reading something written there. I think this valley just finally caught up to what was true the whole time. It was a Tuesday when everything started to unravel. She was grading arithmetic, always arithmetic. It seemed her whole life ran on multiplication tables when she reached for the cattle breeding book Dr. Reyes had lent her. Hoping to better understand the land Jonah spoke of so carefully, so protectively, a folded paper slid out from between the pages. She almost didn't look at it, almost tucked it back in and moved on with her afternoon, except something about the paper's weight felt wrong in her hand, too thick for its age, which made no sense, because the ink on it claimed it was old a deed, dated some 15 years back, laying claim to the North Pasture, the very land Jonah's father had died defending. Wade Colton's signature sat at the bottom. She frowned, held it closer to the window light, and there, something her teacher's eye caught instantly. The same eye had spent 8 years, spotting a child's careful forgery of a parent's signature on a tardy note. The ink was too dark, too fresh. It sat on the page like it hadn't fully settled into the fiber yet, while the paper around it had clearly been aged deliberately, artificially with something like tea or ash, rubbed into the edges. And the signature itself, Wade Colton's hand, was elegant. She'd seen it before, on a letter he'd sent the schoolhouse regarding lease terms, all confident loops and flourishes. This signature wobbled, hesitated. Like whoever wrote it had practiced first, because that's exactly what it was, wasn't it? A practice copy. A forgery still finding its feet. Her hands had gone cold. She found Jonah at the woodpile, axe rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man working out something in his body that his mind couldn't settle. He looked up when her shadow crossed the snow. "You need to see this," she said, holding out the paper. He set the axe down slow. "Read it once. Read it again." And she watched his face do something she hadn't seen before. Watched 12 years of grief harden into something sharper, colder, more dangerous. "Where," he said, "just that. One word, low and tight. Between the pages of Dr. Reyes's cattle book. That's not possible." His jaw worked. "That book's been in his office for years, which means someone put it there recently. Meaning to retrieve it. Meaning to use it." She stepped closer. "Look at the signature," he looked. She watched understanding dawn slow and terrible across his face. "It's fake," he said. "It's worse than fake." She pointed to the margin, where faint pencil marks traced beneath the ink corrections, adjustments, a hand testing the shape of a lie before committing to it. "It's a practice copy. Someone was perfecting a forgery, which means somewhere there's a finished version, a real one. One good enough to hold up in a land office." Jonah went very still. "He's been planning this," he said quietly, "not weeks. Years, 15 years, according to the date on this. My father died 12 years ago. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. This is dated before that. The cold that moved through Wren then had nothing to do with the mountain air, because if the forgery predated his father's death, if Wade Colton, or someone working for him, had been laying the groundwork for this theft years before Ezra Kane ever fell into that ravine, then it wasn't a coincidence, it was a plan, and Ezra Kane had been standing in the way of it. "Jonah," her voice shook just slightly. "I don't think your father fell." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said everything his voice couldn't yet manage. They rode into Copper Creek the next morning, the forged paper folded carefully inside Wren's coat, close to her heart like something that might catch fire if handled carelessly. Dr. Reyes met them at his office, and his face went gray the moment he saw the document. "Where did you find this?" "In your cattle book," Wren said. "The one you lent me." His hands trembled slightly as he took it, held it to the light the way she had. "This book sat on my shelf for 6 years, untouched."
Someone would have had to come into my office, hide it there?
Yes, Jonah's voice was flat, controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting would have. Someone wanted it found, eventually, by someone who'd know what they were looking at. Or, Wren said slowly, a new thought forming, cold and unwelcome. Someone hid it there because your office was the last place anyone would think to look. And it was only found because I happened to borrow that particular book. Which means it wasn't meant to be found at all. Dr. Reyes finished. It was misplaced. By accident, the three of them stood in silence, the weight of that settling over the room like dust after a collapse. "I need to speak with Colton," Jonah said. "Jonah, I'm not going to do anything foolish." His eyes found hers, steady despite the storm clearly moving behind them. "I'm going to ask him a question, that's all." She wanted to believe that was all it would be. Wade Colton received them in his study, all polished wood and good whiskey, and the particular smugness of a man who'd never once in his life had to work for anything he wanted. Kane, he didn't rise. And the new Mrs. Kane. "Married life suits you, Wren." "Don't," Jonah said. "Call her that like you know her." Colton's smile flickered, then steadied. "Something on your mind?" Jonah set the forged deed on the desks between them without a word. Wren watched Colton's face, carefully watched for the flicker, the tell, the moment a man's composure cracked wide enough to see the truth underneath. She saw it, small, gone almost before it arrived. But she'd spent 8 years reading the faces of children trying to hide a lie. And this was no different, just older. Better practiced. "I don't know what this is," Colton said. "It's your signature," Jonah said, "or a hand trying very hard to be your signature." Dated 15 years back. Claiming the north pasture, he leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. And for the first time, Wren saw the full size and weight of him used not for kindness, but for something closer to warning. "My father died 12 years ago, Colton. Which means whoever made this was already planning to take that land before he was in the ground." Silence. Colton's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice, the polish cracking. Just enough. You think you're the only man who ever wanted something in this valley," he said quietly. Not quite a denial. Not quite a confession either, I think, Jonah said. "You've wanted that land since before I could walk. And I think you're not a patient man, Colton. 15 years is a long time to wait for something. Unless you got tired of waiting." "Careful," Colton said. "That's a dangerous accusation to make in a man's own home." "It's not an accusation." Yet the two men stared each other down across the desk, and Wren felt something electric and terrible crackling in the air between them. Old grief and old greed finally circling close enough to touch. "You think I killed your father," Colton said finally, flat, almost amused. though his eyes weren't amused at all. Is that it? 12 years, and you finally work up the nerve to say it to my face? Did you? The question hung there, raw, unanswered. Colton's eyes shifted just for a moment toward Wren, and something in that glance made her skin crawl. Something proprietary and bitter all at once, like a man looking at something he'd once wanted and lost, and never quite forgiven himself for losing. You know, he said slowly, I courted her once. Did Jonah tell you that, Wren? He watched her face for a reaction. 6 weeks. Before Ridley's little performance at the social scared me off. I'll admit that. Wasn't proud of it, but I'll admit it. His mouth twisted. And now look. She's up on your mountain playing schoolteacher to goat farmers. And you two are looking at me like I'm the villain of the story. Are you, Jonas? I'm a businessman, Colton snapped, composure finally cracking clean through. I saw opportunity. Your father was stubborn, wouldn't sell, wouldn't even discuss it like a reasonable man. That's not a crime. Being unwilling to compromise got him exactly what it got him. The room went very quiet, because that wasn't a denial. That was, Wren realized with a chill sinking bone deep, very nearly a confession dressed up in business language, softened just enough to leave room for deniability, but a confession all the same. Jonah's hands had gone white-knuckled against the desk. Say it plain, he said, voice shaking now. 12 years of grief, finally breaking its careful dam. Say what you did to my father plain. To my face, I didn't push him, Colton said. Too quick, too rehearsed, like a line kept ready for exactly this moment for 12 long years. He fell. That's what the coroner said. The coroner your father paid for, Dr. Reyes said quietly from the doorway. Wren hadn't even realized he'd followed them, hadn't heard him arrive. I remember that report, Wade. I was young. I didn't ask enough questions. I've regretted it every year since. Colton's face had gone pale. Get out of my house, he said. All of you were going, Jonah said. But this isn't finished, Colton. Not by a long way. They rode home in silence, the mountains swallowing them mile by mile, the forged deed still folded against Wren's chest like something radioactive. He as good as admitted it, she said finally. When the town had disappeared behind the ridge, I know, we have to tell someone. The sheriff. Jonah's laugh was short, bitter, humorless. Sheriff Doyle's held that badge 11 years. You know who backed his election? Whose money paid for the printing on every poster in town. Wren's stomach dropped. Colton. Jonah's jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the road ahead. I'm not saying Doyle's a crooked man. I'm saying he owes Wade Colton more than a passing debt, and I'm not eager to hand him evidence that might make him choose between doing right and paying that debt back. Then what do? We find more, he said. Real proof. Not a practice forgery hidden by accident. Something that can't be explained away. He glanced at her, and something in his eyes had changed since that morning, sharpened, focused, the grief finally finding somewhere useful to go. You've got a mind for this, Wren, sharper than mine. You caught what I never would have. I'm a teacher. I catch cheating for a living. It's more than that. He reached over, took her gloved hand in his, careful the way he always was, like he was afraid his own strength might do damage he didn't intend. You see things clear, even when they're ugly. Especially then. For 8 years she'd used that clarity to catch children lying about broken slates. Tonight she'd used it to catch a man lying about murder. The scale had changed, the gift hadn't. Sitting here now, hand in Jonah's, riding home to a mountain that had somehow, impossibly, in 3 short weeks become exactly that home, she began to wonder if maybe it had simply been waiting all this time for the right thing to be clear about. That night, riding the last mile home in silence, Wren found herself thinking of her father, a quiet, careful man who'd died when she was 19, who'd once told her that the mark of Prince's character wasn't how they behaved when the room was watching, but how they behaved when they believed no one would ever know. She wondered what he would have made of Jonah Kane. She thought somehow that he would have approved. You've gone quiet, Jonah said. Thinking about my father. Good thoughts? He would have liked you, she said. He didn't trust men who talked too smooth. Said a man who needed pretty words to make his case usually didn't have much of that case underneath them. Something warm moved across Jonah's face in the dark. Wise man. He'd have liked that you don't talk much at all then. That an insult, Mrs. Kane? An observation, she said, echoing his own words back to him, and heard him laugh low, surprised. The sound of it settling into the cold night air like something solid enough to hold on to. The weeks that followed moved like a held breath. Wren taught her small mountain classroom by day, watched the children's numbers grow, watched them warm to her the way the town children never fully had no wisps up here, no eyes sliding sideways at her shape, just hunger for knowledge and gratitude for someone willing to feed it. By evening, she and Jonah pored over land records, old letters, anything Dr. Reyes could quietly pull from the county archive without drawing Colton's attention. They found pieces, fragments, a letter from Ezra Kane to a lawyer in the territorial capital, dated weeks before his death, mentioning threats he refused to specify in writing. A ledger entry showing payment from Colton's father to a surveyor who'd since left the territory entirely. No forwarding address. Name scrubbed clean from every record after. Not proof, not yet. But smoke enough to know, with absolute certainty, that somewhere close by, a fire had been deliberately set and just as deliberately hidden. Otis Bell became a fixture at their table during those weeks, arriving most evenings with whatever scraps of information had drifted his way. Otis, as it turned out, had a cousin who clerked at the county land office, and a memory for old grievances that made him better than any archive at recalling who'd owed what to whom, and when, and why. "There's a name you ought to know," Otis said one night, turning his hat over in his hands the way men did in this house. Wren had noticed, when the news inside them was heavier than they wanted to let on. "Fella named Whitfield, surveyor. Worked this valley about 20 years back before your time, Jonah. Sudden, middle of a job, no explanation. Left half his equipment behind in his boarding room like he'd meant to come back for it. Vanished where, Jonah asked. Nobody knows. That's the trouble with vanishing." Otis's mouth twisted, humorless. "But my cousin says there's a ledger entry buried deep, showing a payment from Colton's father to a man matching that description, dated about a month before he disappeared. Paid in full. No services rendered on record." Wren felt the pieces settling into place the way they sometimes did, when a difficult sum finally resolved itself on the slate, separate, disconnected numbers suddenly revealing the pattern that had been hiding in them the whole time. "He surveyed a false boundary," she said slowly. "It's what the payment was for, not for vanishing. For drawing a line where Colton's father wanted it, regardless of where it actually belonged. And then he vanished anyway," Jonah said, voice gone flat and cold. "Because a man who'll falsify a survey for money is a man who might do it again for someone else's money. Easier to make him disappear than to trust he'd stay bought." The three of them sat with that a long moment, the fire popping low in the hearth, the weight of it settling over the room like snow accumulating on a roof that hadn't been built to hold this much. "That's 2 deaths now," Wren said quietly. "Your father, this surveyor. How many more people has this family buried to keep hold of land that was never rightfully theirs?" Nobody answered her. "Getting nervous," Jonah said one night, staring into the fire. "Dr. Reyes says Colton's been asking around town, who we've been talking to, what we've found. How does he know we're looking? Because a man who spent 15 years covering his tracks notices when someone starts walking the same ground twice." Jonah's eyes were hard in the firelight. "He's not going to sit still forever, Wren. Men like Colton don't wait to be caught. They act first." She felt it too, a tightening in the air. The particular held stillness of a mountain before a storm breaks. Every trip into town felt watched. Every conversation felt overheard before it started. "What does he do?" she asked quietly. "When he acts." Jonah didn't answer right away. And when he finally did, his voice had gone low and rough, with something that sounded almost like fear, the first time she'd heard that particular note in it since the day they married. "I don't know," he said. "But I know it won't be subtle. Not anymore. Not now that we're close." The threat came on a gray morning 3 days later, delivered not by Colton himself, but by 2 of his hired men, riding up the mountain road with a surveyor trailing behind them, all of them carrying the particular swagger of men who believed the law already belonged to them. Wren watched from the schoolroom window, her small class of 7 going quiet and wide-eyed behind her, as Jonah walked out to meet them in the yard, calm on the surface, coiled tight beneath it. Mr. Colton's had his lawyer file a form claim. One of the men announced, unrolling a paper with theatrical care. North pasture boundary through to the ridgeline. Survey confirms the original deed. The original deed, Jonah said flatly. Burned in a fire at the county office 9 years ago. Convenient that. This is a certified copy. Certified by who? The man's smile didn't waver. By the same office that'll enforce it, if you don't cooperate. He rolled the paperback up, unhurried, cruel in his patience. Mr. Colton wanted me to pass along that he's a reasonable man, willing to discuss fair compensation. 7 days, Kane. After that, this goes through the courts. And courts in this territory tend to favor men who own the newspaper and half the judge's mortgages. They rode off without waiting for a response, leaving the threat hanging in the cold mountain air like smoke that refused to clear. Jonah stood in the yard a long time after they'd gone, fists clenched at his sides, and Wren watched him from the window with her heart hammering against her ribs. 7 days. She thought of the rifle in the wooden case upstairs, the words carved deep into its stock. This land was bought in blood. It will not be sold in silence. She thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything else had, in this entire strange sudden marriage, this is not going to end with paperwork. That evening, after the children had gone home and the fire had burned low, Jonah came to find her where she sat at the small writing desk he'd built her. Staring at nothing, the forged deeds spread out before her, like a puzzle she couldn't stop turning over. I need to teach you something, he said quietly. She looked up. Found him holding the wooden case from upstairs, the one she discovered on her first night in this house. The rifle in the catching light like something waiting. Jonah, I'm not asking you to fight, he said. I'm asking you not to be defenseless. Those are different things. He set the case down on the desk between them, opened it slow, reverent, the way a man opens something that cost him more than it should have. 7 days, Wren. I don't know what Colton does when those 7 days run out, but I'm not going to let you find out unprepared. She looked at the rifle a long moment, at the words carved into the stock, worn smooth by a thumb that had traced them 1,000 times over 12 long years of grief and patience and waiting. Then she closed her hand around it. Show me, she said. And outside the mountain wind picked up, moving through the pines with a sound like something enormous, finally slowly waking up. The night before the rifle lessons began in earnest, Wren sat at the writing desk long after Jonah had gone up to check the horses, a single sheet of paper in front of her, blank, the candle burning low. She didn't know why she felt compelled to write it, only that some old instinct, the same one that had once told her. Thomas Ridley's smile didn't reach his eyes, told her that a woman standing where she stood, with a man carrying the weight Jonah carried, owed it to herself to put certain things down where they couldn't be lost. If anything should happen to me, she wrote and stopped, crossed it out. Start again, dear Odette. If you are reading this, something has gone wrong, and I find I am not half so frightened of that as I would have expected 3 months ago. I want you to know that marrying Jonah Kane was the first choice I ever made entirely for myself, with no thought for what the town would say about it, and it was the best decision of my life, regardless of how it ends. Tell Mrs. students I profit of every one of them. Tell Mrs. Patterson I forgave her long before she ever asked. And tell yourself, because I know you'll need telling, none of this was your fault for not talking me out of it. You never could have. I finally found something worth being brave for. She folded it twice, sealed it with a bit of candle wax, and tucked it into the family Bible on the mantel, where Odette would find it easily enough if she ever needed to. Jonah found her sitting there when he came back in, staring at the fire, her hands folded in her lap. "What's wrong?" he said, immediately alert. The particular stillness that meant he was reading her the way she'd learned to forged signatures. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "I wrote a letter." In case she didn't need to finish the sentence, he understood. He crossed the room slowly and knelt in front of her chair, an enormous man, folding himself down to meet her, eyes level, careful the way he was careful with everything he valued. "I wrote one too," he admitted quietly. 3 days ago. It's in my father's journal, tucked behind the last page." They looked at each other a long moment. Two people who had married as strangers for practical reasons and now sat here weeks later, each having quietly prepared for the possibility of losing the other. "I don't want to need that letter," Wren said, her voice unsteady for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Neither do I." He took her hands in his, the calluses rough and familiar now, no longer the hands of a stranger. "But I'd rather know it's written and never needed than leave anything unsaid, waiting on a day that might not come." She thought of Thomas Ridley. Then one last time she promised herself. One last time, and how he'd never once, in 6 weeks of careful courtship, said a single thing to her that he hadn't first measured for how it would sound to other people. Jonah Kane had just knelt on a cold floor and confessed to writing his own funeral letter without her having to ask. "I love you," she said. The words surprised her on their way out, arriving before she decided to say them, true regardless. Something broke open in his face, not sadness. Something closer to wonder. "Say that again," he said, "when this is over. When Colton's dealt with and the danger's past." "Say it again then, so I know it wasn't just the fear talking." "I will," she promised. "I already know it won't have changed. 6 days." Wren counted them the way she used to count multiplication tables, quiet, steady, a rhythm to keep her hands from shaking. 6 days since the men rode up the mountain with their rolled paper and their patient cruelty. One day left before Wade Colton's deadline came due. She stood in the yard at dawn, rifle steady in her hands the way Jonah had taught her, and put 3 shots into a fence post from 30 paces, all 3 close together. "Tight enough to cover with her palm better," Jonah said from behind her. "Every day better. Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised." He came to stand beside her, took the rifle gently to check its action, the same careful reverence he gave everything he touched. "I'm proud." Different thing entirely, proud. That word stilled something strange to her chest every time he used it, because it cost him nothing at all to say, no calculation in it, no measuring of what her existence might cost him in front of other people. "Riders," he said suddenly, voice dropping low. He followed his gaze down the mountain road. 2 men, then a third. Then her stomach dropped Dr. Reyes's buggy, moving fast, faster than an old man usually pushed a horse. Something was wrong. Dr. Reyes arrived breathless, hat gone, coat flapping open like he hadn't stopped to fasten it. "Colton's moved the deadline," he said, chest heaving. "Word came down an hour ago. He's not waiting 7 days. He's coming tonight." Tonight, Jonah's voice had gone flat, controlled, the particular calm of a man forcing panic back down his own throat. "Why, because you went to Sheriff Doyle yesterday." Reyes's eyes flicked to Wren, apologetic. "I know you asked me to keep that quiet. I don't know how word got back to Colton so fast. But it did." Wren felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Someone in Doyle's office," Jonah said slowly. "Has to be. Or Doyle himself." Wren said silence. Heavy, ugly silence, because both of them had circled that thought before and neither had wanted to land on it. "There's more," Dr. Ray said. "Colton's bringing men. 4, maybe 5. And Wren, he hesitated. He specifically asked if you'd be here. Cold moved through her, quick and absolute. Why would he ask that? Rice's face had gone gray. Because a man like Cole doesn't just want the land anymore. 12 years of losing quietly does something to men like him. Makes the winning personal. He looked between them both. I think he wants you to watch him take it, Jonah. And I think he wants Wren there, so you have something more to lose than dirt and pasture. Jonah sent riders down to the mountain families that evening quiet, urgent messages, the kind sent by men who'd learned the hard way that trouble rarely announced itself twice. By dusk, 5 men had gathered in the yard. Neighbors. Fathers of the children Wren taught in her small east-facing schoolroom. Men who owed Jonah Kane nothing on paper but everything in the particular currency of mountain folk who'd watched each other's backs through hard winters for years. Colton's bringing 5, Jonah told them, voice steady despite everything roiling beneath it. We match that, at least. Maybe more if we're smart about positioning. We're with you, said Otis Bell. The nearest neighbor, a wiry man with a shotgun already slung over one shoulder. Man tried to run my family off our creek claim 3 years back. I don't forget things like that. Others nodded. Murmured agreement. And Wren. Standing at the edge of the gathering with the rifle Jonah had taught her to hold steady, felt something unexpected rise up through the fear. Not just fear, belonging. These were not the whispering voices of Copper Creek, the ones that had followed her for 8 years like a shadow she couldn't shake. These were people who simply decided, without asking anything of her body or her past, that she and Jonah were worth standing beside. I want a position upstairs, she said, stepping forward. East window. Clear view of the road. Otis Bell looked at her, then at Jonah, uncertain. She's the best shot among us who isn't already placed, Jonah just said simply, before anyone could argue otherwise. She stays upstairs, covers the approach. That's not a lesser job. That's the job that keeps the rest of you alive. No one argued after that. The waiting was the worst part. Wren sat at the east window as the sky went from orange to violet to a deep, star-scattered black, the rifle resting across her knees, her heart beating a rhythm she couldn't quiet, no matter how many multiplication tables she silently recited. She thought of every voice that had once told her to take up less space and realized, watching the road for the first flicker of torchlight, that she had finally stopped listening to any of them, which was, she understood now, the only thing that had ever actually mattered. They came just after midnight, torches' first small orange stars bobbing up the dark mountain road, then the sound of horses, then Wade Colton's voice, carrying easy and confident across the cold night air, like a man who'd never once considered the possibility of losing. Kane, he called. Come out here and be reasonable. Jonah stepped onto the porch alone, rifle low but ready, moonlight silvering his shoulders until he looked less like a man and more like something carved directly out of the mountain itself. You're trespassing. Colton, I'm collecting what's owed me. Colton's men fanned out behind him, 5 riders, torches throwing long, broken shadows across the yard. Last chance. Sign the transfer. Walk away with your life and your pretty wife, and we forget this ever happened. You forged that deed. Prove it. Colton's smile flashed in the torchlight. Oh, wait. You already tried that with Sheriff Doyle. How'd that work out for you? Something cold settled in Wren's stomach, so it had been Doyle. Or for someone close enough to Doyle to make no difference. Doyle's compromised, Jonas said, loud enough for the mountain house men positioned in the trees and behind the barn to hear clearly. Everyone here should know that before tonight's done, Doyle's smart enough to know which side pays better, Colton said, unbothered. Something you never learned, Kane. Your father didn't learn it either. Cost him everything. Something in Jonah cracked loose, ears held taut, finally snapping. Say it, he said, voice shaking now with 12 years of held-back grief, finally breaking loose. Say what you did. Plain. Right now, in front of witnesses, Colton laughed. Actually laughed, cold and easy under the stars. You want a confession? Fine. He nudged his horse forward a step, close enough that Torchlight caught the full cruelty in his eyes. Your father was in my way, so I removed him. Simple as moving a fence post. He shrugged, casual, monstrous in its casualness. Didn't even feel like much of a crime. Just business. The yard went utterly silent. And then it didn't, because one of Colton's men, the wiry one with the scar along his jaw, went for his gun. The second Otis Bell's voice cracked out from the tree line. You heard that, all of you. Witnesses. And the whole night's exploded at once into noise and fire and chaos. Renzen's world narrowed to the sight line of her rifle. Below her, Jonah dove for the porch rail as gunfire cracked across the yard. One of Colton's men wheeled his horse toward the barn where two mountain neighbors had taken position. Otis Bell returned fire from the tree line, and a torch went spinning to the ground, catching dry grass, throwing wild orange light across everything. She found her target, steadied her breath the way Jonah had taught her hold, squeeze, not pull. Fired. The man aiming at the barn door spun sideways, weapon flying from his grip, and dropped hard into the mud. Her first shot at a living person. Her hands shook after, violent and sudden, the rifle nearly slipping from her grip. No time. No time for that now. Because below, Wade Colton had dismounted, stalking across the yard toward the porch with a fury that had clearly been building for 12 long years, gun raised, eyes locked on Jonah like nothing else in the world existed. Finish it then, Colton screamed. Same as your father. Same ravine, same story. Jonah lunged from the porch with a sound that wasn't quite human, tackling Colton hard into the dirt, and the two men went down grappling, rolling. 12 years of grief and greed finally colliding, with nothing left between them but bare hands and rage. Wren's rifle swung to follow, except she had no shot, no angle. The two men too tangled together to risk a bullet. Around them the yard was chaos. 3 of Colton's men down or fled. Otis Bell shouting something she couldn't make out. The grass fire spreading fast along the fence line, throwing everything into flickering, uncertain light. Below her, Colton broke free of Jonah's grip, scrambled backward through the mud, and came up with his gun already rising. Should have died with him, Colton screamed, finger tightening on the trigger, aimed dead center at Jonah's chest. Wren didn't think. She grabbed the only thing within reach, fast enough the heavy brass school bell sitting on the windowsill. The one she'd carried up from Copper Creek to call her mountain students in from recess. Small and useless and exactly, perfectly weighted for throwing hard and true. She hurled it out the open window. Strength years of ringing it twice daily had built into her arm. It struck Colton square in the temple with a sound like a struck anvil. His shot went wide, tearing splinters from the porch post inches from where Jonah had been standing a half second before. And Colt staggered sideways, dazed, gun slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Jonah was on him before he hit the ground. What followed happened fast, and then seemed to happen very slowly, the way violence always does in memory, afterward stretched thin, each second its own separate frozen frame. Jonah's hands closed around Colton's throat. 12 years of grief finally finding its target, finally close enough to squeeze. This is for my father, he said, voice raw, barely human. 12 years, Colton. 12 years I myself will believe it was an accident, because the alternative was unbearable. Colton's face was going purple, legs kicking weakly in the mud. Jonah. Wren's voice cracked out across the yard, cutting through everything. Don't let him take this from you too. For a moment, one terrible, suspended moment, she thought he wouldn't stop. Thought 12 years of buried rage had finally found a place to spend itself and wouldn't be talked back down. Then his eyes found hers at the window, and something in his face broke, and his hands loosened. Colton gasped, wheezing, alive. He's not worth it, Jonah said, voice shaking. He's not worth what it would cost you. What it would cost us. Around the yard, gunfire had gone quiet. 2 of Colton's men lay wounded, disarmed, the fire along the fence line finally dying down to smoking char. Otis Bell and the others moved in with rope, binding the survivors while they were still too dazed to resist. Wren came down the stairs 2 at a time, out into the cold night air, and found Jonah exactly where she'd known she would, standing over Colton's bound, gasping form, chest heaving, 12 years of held breath, finally releasing. He turned when she reached him, pulled her into arms, still trembling with everything that had just happened, and held on like she was the only solid thing left standing on that mountain. I thought he was going to kill you, she whispered against his chest. I thought that bell was the finest sound I ever heard, he said, and something in his voice cracked between a laugh and a sob. Dr. Reyes arrived at first light with the territorial marshal in tow, a stern, unbribable man from the capital, entirely outside Wade Colton's reach, summoned quietly days earlier as insurance against exactly this outcome, the forged deed, ledger entries. The surveyor scrubbed records, and now laid over all of it 5 witnesses, Otis Bell chief among them, who'd heard Wade Colton confess with his own mouth, under open sky, to the murder of Ezra Kane 12 years past. It was enough, more than enough, Sheriff Doyle. When confronted, folded within the hour, desperate to save what remained of his own name, and gave up everything, every payment, every favor, every year of quiet complicity stretching back far longer than anyone had suspected. It was Doyle, in the end, who explained the book. Colton's father had kept the practice forgery among his private papers for years' insurance. He'd called it once to a drinking companion, in case he ever needed proof he could just as easily destroy. When the old man died, the papers passed through careless hands before landing, by pure clumsy chance, in a box of donated volumes for the county library. Dr. Reyes had simply been the last man foolish enough not to check what he'd been given. Wade Colton was led away in irons as the sun rose fully over the ridge, past the schoolroom Wren had built, past the pines his family had coveted for 15 long years, past the mountain that would now, finally, stay exactly where it belonged. He paused once, near the wagon, and looked back at her. You could have had an easier life, he said, voice bitter, defeated. Married someone respectable, someone who wouldn't have got you shot at over a grudge that was never yours. Wren looked at him a long moment, at the smallness of him, finally, stripped of money and menace both. This is the easier life, she said quietly, because for the first time since I was 24 years old, nobody's asking me to be smaller than I am. He had nothing to say to that. She didn't wait to see his face change. She turned and walked back toward the schoolroom, where 9 children were already gathering for their morning lesson, waiting on a woman who had never once asked them to be smaller than they were either. That, she thought, was the whole of it. Not revenge, just room to breathe. The marshal loaded Colton into the wagon, and Wade Colton disappeared down the mountain road for the last time, taking 12 years of buried grief and 15 years of careful greed with him, leaving nothing behind but scorched grass and quiet. The land was formally restored within the month, every acre, every pasture, the north boundary settled once and for all in Jonah Kane's name, the name his father had died defending, the name his mother's careful handwriting still lived on inside a worn leather journal on the cabin bookshelf. Wren stood in the yard that afternoon, watching Jonah walk the newly confirmed boundary line with something in his shoulders she hadn't seen before. Not the tired weight of 12 years' grief, something lighter, something almost like peace. You did that, he's coming to stand beside her. Every piece of it, the forgery, the confession. That bell, he shook his head, something like wonder breaking across his face. I've never seen anything like that bell in my whole life. I've been ringing it twice a day for 8 years, she said. Turns out that's good for more than calling children in from recess. He laughed a real laugh, rare and warm, and pulled her close. Marry me again, he said suddenly. She blinked. We're already married, not like that first time. Not practical, his hands found hers, careful as always, like she was something precious he still couldn't quite believe belonged to him. I asked you to marry me because I needed help surviving winter. I'm asking you now because I love you, Wren Kane. All of you, exactly as you are. I wouldn't change 1 inch. Something in her chest, some old wound she'd carried since a parlor in Ohio 3 years past, finally quietly closed over. I love you too, she said, which terrifies me a little. In the best way, spring came early to the mountain that year, the way it sometimes does after a hard winter, as though the land itself wanted to make up for what it had put everyone through. Aaron stood in the doorway of the nursery. Jonah had built onto the east side of the cabin, one hand resting against the gentle curve of her belly, watching morning light spill gold across a cradle carved from mountain oak. Slow through the open window, she could hear her students 9 now, growing every season gathering for lessons, their voices carrying bright and eager across land that had finally, after 12 long years, stopped being a battlefield and become simply peacefully home. Jonah's arms came around her from behind, his chin resting against her hair. Thinking about names? He asked. Thinking about how far we've come, she said. From a stranger proposing on Main Street to this, any regrets? She turned in his arms, looked up at this enormous, careful, tired-eyed man who had never once, not for a single moment since that first cold conversation outside the mercantile, asked her to be anything other than exactly herself. Only that it took me 27 years to believe I deserved this, she said. Outside, the school bell rang, steady, bright, calling children in from the mountain morning, and Wren Kane smiled and stepped forward for viewer to the rest of her life, carried not by what the world had once said she was worth, but by what she had, at long last, learned to know for herself. That autumn, a new family arrived at the base of the mountain, the Millers, come west with too little money and too many hopes. And among their 4 children was a girl of 11 named Charlotte, round-faced and quiet, who hung back at the edge of the schoolroom door on her first morning like she expected to be turned away before she'd even been asked her name. Wren recognized something in the way the girl held herself. The careful stillness, the habit of making herself smaller in doorways, as though smallness might purchase some kind of safety. You must be Charlotte, Wren said, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. I saved you a seat by the window. Best light for reading, and the nicest view of the ridge when your mind wanders, which I promise you it will, because everyone's does. Charlotte blinked, clearly braced for something else. I remember a comment about her size, perhaps. the kind she'd likely collected in whatever town they'd come from, tucked away and carried like stones in a pocket. It never came. By the second week, Charlotte was the first to raise her hand at arithmetic, the last to leave at day's end, lingering by Wren's desk with question after question, drinking in attention the way a plant long kept in shadow drinks first real sun. "Mrs. Kane," she asked Watt one afternoon, when the other children had gone and only the two of them remained in the lamplit room, "were you always good at teaching? Or did you have to learn it, same as I'm learning fractions?" Wren considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions from children, because children, she had found, rarely asked anything that didn't deserve a true answer. "I had to learn quite a lot of things," she said. "How to teach was one of them. But the harder lesson, the one that took me longer, was learning that the way I looked never had one thing to do with whether I was worth listening to." She held Charlotte's gaze steadily. "I don't know what anyone said to you, back wherever you came from, but I'd guess from the way you stand in doorways that somebody said something unkind." Charlotte's chin trembled just slightly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "Well," Wren said gently, "they were wrong. And one day, if you're patient with yourself, you'll know that so completely it won't even sting to remember." They said it at all, she thought, watching the girl walk home across land that had once been a battlefield and was now simply, peacefully, a place where children learned their letters undisturbed, that this more than the restored deed, more than Colton's empty study, more even than the quiet nights by the fire with Jonah's arm around her shoulders, was the truest measure of everything they'd fought to keep. Not just land, not just safety, room enough for the next girl who needed to learn, early and for good, that she had never once been the problem. Jonah found her sitting alone in the schoolroom that evening, well after the last lamp should have been out, staring at the small chalk drawing. Charlotte had left on the corner of the board a crude, earnest sketch of a mountain, with a tiny house at its base and two even tinier figures standing in the doorway. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything's exactly right," she said, and meant it completely, and reached for his hand, and together they walked home beneath a sky gone violet and gold with the last of the day, toward a house that had once held nothing but grief and a promise, and now held, at long last, something very close to peace.